Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1831, the rural counties of Virginia held secrets that would challenge everything people believed about family, identity, and the bonds that supposedly connect mothers to their children. What began as a simple reunion between a woman and her long-lost daughter would unravel into one of the most psychologically devastating cases ever documented in the antebellum South. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. The story centers on Hannah Green, a 20-year-old woman whose extraordinary beauty had become both her salvation and her curse. Born into slavery on a tobacco plantation near the James River, Hannah possessed features so striking that visitors would stop their conversations mid-sentence when she entered a room. Her skin held the warm tone of amber honey. Her eyes carried flecks of green that seemed to shift with the light, and her hair fell in waves that caught the Virginia sun like silk threads. But Hannah's beauty came with a price that no one, least of all Hannah herself, could have anticipated. In the winter of 1831, a woman arrived at the Whitmore plantation claiming to be Hannah's mother. The woman, who called herself Margaret Thornfield, was well-dressed, spoke with the refined accent of Charleston society, and carried documents that appeared to prove Hannah's parentage. What should have been a joyous reunion would instead become a nightmare that would haunt the Whitmore plantation for generations to come. The truth behind Hannah's origins and the real reason for Margaret's sudden appearance would reveal a web of deception, manipulation, and psychological cruelty that defied comprehension. The Whitmore plantation sat on nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land in Hanover County, Virginia. The main house, built in 1796, rose 3 stories above the Virginia countryside, its white columns gleaming against the red brick facade. Behind the main house, a collection of outbuildings housed the plantation's operations, the tobacco barns, the blacksmith shop, the quarters where enslaved families lived in cramped wooden structures that leaked when the rains came. Thomas Whitmore had inherited the plantation from his father, along with 63 enslaved people who worked the fields from dawn until dusk. Unlike many plantation owners of his time, Whitmore maintained detailed records of his human property, noting births, deaths, sales, and purchases in ledgers that he kept locked in his study. These records would later prove crucial to understanding Hannah's true story. Hannah had been brought to the plantation as an infant in 1811. The bill of sale, preserved in Whitmore's meticulous files, listed her simply as one female child, approximately 6 months of age, sold by estate of Samuel Morrison, deceased. No mention was made of her parents, her birthplace, or any other identifying information. She was listed in the inventory between a bay mare and a collection of farming tools. As Hannah grew, she was assigned to work in the main house under the supervision of Mrs. Whitmore, a stern woman who ran the household with military precision. Hannah showed an aptitude for delicate work, and by the age of 15, she was responsible for maintaining Mrs. Whitmore's extensive wardrobe and assisting with the elaborate dinner parties that the family hosted for neighboring plantation owners. It was during these dinner parties that Hannah's beauty first became a topic of conversation among the guests. Visitors would ask about her parentage, speculating about the mixture of bloodlines that had produced such striking features. Mrs. Whitmore would deflect these questions with polite but firm responses, making it clear that such discussions were inappropriate in her home. The other enslaved people on the plantation treated Hannah with a mixture of affection and wariness. Her beauty set her apart, creating a distance that she neither sought nor understood. She formed few close friendships, spending most of her free time reading books that she borrowed from the Whitmore Library, teaching herself to write with scraps of paper and charcoal when no one was watching. The plantation's daily rhythm followed the seasons and the demands of tobacco cultivation. Spring brought the careful tending of seed beds. Summer meant long days in the fields, transplanting and cultivating the growing plants. And autumn brought the harvest that would determine the plantation's prosperity for the year. Through all of these cycles, Hannah moved through the main house like a ghost, beautiful and silent, performing her duties with a competence that impressed even Mrs. Whitmore. But beneath the surface tranquility of plantation life, tensions simmered that would eventually explode into the open. The other house servants whispered among themselves about Hannah's origins, creating elaborate theories about her parentage that grew more fantastical with each retelling. Some claimed she was the daughter of a wealthy planter who had fallen in love with an enslaved woman. Others insisted she was the product of a liaison between a white woman and her family's coachman, abandoned to hide the scandal. These whispered conversations always ended when Hannah entered the room, leaving her isolated in a bubble of speculation and mystery that she was powerless to penetrate. She knew nothing of her origins beyond what the plantation records revealed, and the Whitmores had made it clear that questions about her past were unwelcome. The winter of 1830 brought unusual cold to central Virginia. Ice formed thick on the James River, and snow fell almost continuously from December through February. The plantation's operations slowed to a crawl, with most of the field hands assigned to indoor work repairing tools and maintaining equipment. It was during this period of enforced inactivity that Margaret Thornfield arrived at the plantation. She came on a Tuesday morning in late February, driving herself in a small carriage pulled by a single horse. The sight of a well-dressed woman traveling alone immediately attracted attention from the plantation's inhabitants. Margaret appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s, with graying brown hair pinned back in an elaborate style that spoke of wealth and sophistication. Her dress was made of fine wool in a deep blue that complemented her pale complexion, and she wore jewelry that caught the weak winter sunlight. When Margaret knocked on the front door of the main house, Mrs. Whitmore herself answered, unusual for a woman who typically left such tasks to the house servants. The two women spoke in low voices on the front porch for several minutes before Mrs. Whitmore invited the visitor inside. Their conversation continued in the front parlor for more than an hour, during which time the house servants were instructed to remain in the kitchen and not to disturb them. Hannah was working in the upstairs rooms when the meeting took place, carefully cleaning and organizing Mrs. Whitmore's jewelry collection. She could hear the murmur of voices from below, but could not make out the words being spoken. Something in the tone of the conversation, however, made her uneasy. There was an intensity to the voices that suggested the discussion was anything but casual. When Mrs. Whitmore finally summoned Hannah to the parlor, the young woman descended the stairs with a growing sense of dread that she could not explain. She found Margaret Thornfield seated in the best chair, studying her with an expression that seemed to combine satisfaction and something else that Hannah could not identify. Mrs. Whitmore stood behind her guest, her face pale and drawn in a way that Hannah had never seen before. Margaret rose when Hannah entered the room, moving toward her with outstretched arms. "My dear child," she said, her voice thick with emotion that sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. "I have searched for you for so many years. I am your mother, Hannah. I am Margaret Thornfield, and I have come to take you home." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She had long ago given up hope of ever learning anything about her family, and the sudden appearance of this woman, claiming to be her mother, felt surreal and frightening. Margaret's eyes were the same green as her own, and there were similarities in their facial structure that could not be denied. But something in Margaret's manner, in the way she held herself and spoke, filled Hannah with a deep unease that she could not articulate. Mrs. Whitmore explained that Margaret had presented documents proving her relationship to Hannah, including a birth certificate that listed Hannah as the daughter of Margaret Thornfield, born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1811. According to Margaret's story, she had been forced to give up her infant daughter due to financial difficulties following her husband's death. She had spent the intervening years searching for Hannah, finally tracing her to the Whitmore plantation through records she had obtained in Charleston. The story seemed plausible, even touching, but Hannah found herself recoiling from Margaret's embraces and declarations of maternal love. There was something performative about the woman's emotions, as if she were playing a role rather than experiencing genuine feeling. When Margaret spoke of the years of searching and longing, her eyes remained cold and calculating, despite the tears that she claimed were tears of joy. Thomas Whitmore was summoned from his study to review Margaret's documents and to discuss the legal implications of her claim. Virginia law in 1831 was clear about the ownership of enslaved people, but cases involving disputed parentage and freedom papers were not uncommon. Margaret presented what appeared to be manumission papers, documents that would theoretically grant Hannah her freedom and allow her to leave the plantation with her supposed mother. The documents appeared authentic, bearing the proper seals and signatures required by South Carolina law. Whitmore examined them carefully, noting the quality of the paper and the apparent age of the ink. If the papers were genuine, he would have no legal right to prevent Hannah from leaving, regardless of the money he had invested in her upbringing and training. But Whitmore was a careful man who had learned not to trust appearances in business dealings. He requested time to verify the documents with authorities in Charleston, a process that would take several weeks given the limitations of communication in 1831. Margaret agreed to wait, accepting Whitmore's offer of accommodation in the main house while the verification process took place. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Margaret settled into the plantation routine with an ease that struck many as unusual for someone who claimed to have spent years in genteel poverty. She knew how to manage household servants, how to conduct herself at formal meals, and how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of plantation life. Her manners suggested extensive experience with wealth and privilege, contradicting her story of financial hardship following her husband's death. During her stay, Margaret insisted on spending long periods alone with Hannah, claiming that she wanted to make up for the lost years of their relationship. These private conversations took place behind closed doors, either in Margaret's guest room or during long walks around the plantation grounds. Hannah emerged from these sessions looking increasingly pale and distressed, but when questioned by Mrs. Whitmore or other members of the household, she claimed that nothing was wrong. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched Margaret's behavior with growing suspicion. They noted how she studied the layout of the main house, asking detailed questions about the location of valuables and the family's daily routines. Her interest in Hannah seemed to focus less on maternal affection and more on detailed questions about Hannah's skills, her ability to read and write, and her knowledge of wealthy households. Sarah, an elderly woman who had worked in the main house for over 30 years, confided to the cook that Margaret's story didn't make sense. No woman searches 20 years for a child just to ask how well she can polish silver, Sarah observed. That woman wants something from Hannah, but it ain't love. These concerns might have been dismissed as the suspicious nature of enslaved people toward any white stranger, but they were shared by Mrs. Whitmore herself. She noticed that Margaret showed little interest in hearing about Hannah's childhood, her personality, or her experiences growing up on the plantation. Instead, Margaret's questions focused on practical matters. Could Hannah manage a large household? Did she know how to prepare elaborate meals? Could she read and write well enough to keep accounts? Most disturbing were the changes in Hannah's behavior during Margaret's visit. The young woman, who had always been quiet but composed, became increasingly nervous and withdrawn. She started at unexpected sounds, had difficulty sleeping, and seemed to be listening constantly for something that others could not hear. When asked about her conversations with Margaret, Hannah would only say that her mother was teaching her about their family's history and her rightful place in the world. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to question Hannah more directly about her interactions with Margaret, but the young woman seemed incapable of providing clear answers. She would begin to speak about their conversations, then stop abruptly, as if she had forgotten what she intended to say. Her responses became increasingly evasive, and she began to avoid eye contact with everyone except Margaret. The verification process for Margaret's documents proved more complex than expected. Letters to Charleston authorities went unanswered for weeks, and when responses finally arrived, they raised more questions than they resolved. The officials confirmed that Margaret Thornfield was a real person who had lived in Charleston, but they could find no record of her marriage to a man named Thornfield or of Hannah's birth in their jurisdiction. Additional inquiries revealed that Margaret had left Charleston abruptly in 1829, owing substantial debts to local merchants and creditors. She had been involved in several business ventures that had failed under suspicious circumstances, leaving investors with significant losses. The picture that emerged was not of a grieving mother searching for her lost child, but of a woman with a history of fraud and manipulation. When Whitmore confronted Margaret with this information, she remained calm and composed, explaining that the discrepancies were due to errors in record-keeping and the confusion that often surrounded the lives of women who had remarried. She produced additional documents that appeared to address some of the concerns, but Whitmore's suspicions continued to grow. The turning point came when one of the plantation's field hands discovered Margaret rummaging through Whitmore's study late one night. She claimed to have been looking for paper to write a letter, but the man observed that she was examining the plantation's financial records and property inventories. When confronted the next morning, Margaret again had a reasonable explanation, but the incident confirmed Whitmore's growing conviction that his guest was not what she appeared to be. More troubling was the discovery that Hannah had been asking other enslaved people detailed questions about the plantation's security measures, the location of valuable items, and the family's travel plans. When questioned, Hannah seemed confused by her own behavior, claiming that she didn't remember asking such questions or understanding why she would need such information. The truth began to emerge when Mrs. Whitmore observed one of Margaret's private conversations with Hannah through a crack in the door. She witnessed Margaret speaking to Hannah in a low, hypnotic voice, repeating phrases about Hannah's duty to her mother and her obligation to help reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Margaret's manner was neither loving nor maternal, but cold and controlling, like a trainer working with an animal. Mrs. Whitmore realized that Margaret was systematically manipulating Hannah, using a combination of claimed maternal authority and psychological techniques to bend the young woman to her will. The conversations that Margaret called catching up were actually sessions where she was programming Hannah to gather information and eventually participate in what appeared to be a planned theft. The psychological manipulation went far deeper than simple commands or requests for information. Margaret was methodically destroying Hannah's sense of identity and independence, replacing it with absolute dependence on her supposed mother's guidance and approval. She convinced Hannah that her 20 years on the plantation had been a form of imprisonment. that the Whitmores had stolen her from her rightful family and used her for their own purposes. But perhaps most disturbing was Margaret's use of Hannah's own beauty as a weapon against her. She convinced the young woman that her appearance was both a gift and a burden that only a mother could help her manage. Margaret spoke constantly about the dangerous attention that Hannah's beauty attracted, the need to protect herself from men who would exploit her, and the importance of using her appearance strategically rather than allowing others to benefit from it. These conversations took place during long walks around the plantation, where Margaret would point out the enslaved people working in the fields and explain to Hannah how different her life should have been. She painted pictures of the elegant Charleston society where Hannah supposedly belonged, describing balls and parties where beautiful women like Hannah were celebrated rather than hidden away on remote plantations. The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. Margaret alternated between expressions of maternal love and subtle threats about what would happen to Hannah if she failed to embrace her true identity and obligations. She created a worldview where loyalty to one's blood family was the highest moral imperative, where any hesitation or questioning was a betrayal of the deepest bonds of nature. Hannah began to exhibit signs of severe psychological distress. She stopped eating regularly, complained of nightmares that she could not remember upon waking, and started to speak in a voice that sounded different from her usual tone. The other house servants noticed that she would sometimes stand motionless for minutes at a time, staring at nothing, as if her mind had simply stopped functioning. Most disturbing were the moments when Hannah would speak about her future plans with Margaret in a voice that sounded rehearsed and artificial. She would describe leaving the plantation and beginning a new life with her mother, but her words sounded like repetitions of phrases she'd been taught, rather than expressions of her own desires or feelings. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to intervene, trying to speak privately with Hannah about her concerns regarding Margaret's true motives. But Hannah became agitated and defensive when anyone questioned her supposed mother's legitimacy or intentions. She accused Mrs. Whitmore of being jealous of her happiness and of trying to prevent her from claiming her rightful inheritance and place in society. The situation reached a crisis point when Thomas Whitmore received a detailed response from authorities in Charleston that definitively exposed Margaret's fraud. The real Margaret Thornfield had died in 1827, and the woman staying at the plantation was actually Elizabeth Morrison, a notorious confidence artist who had been swindling wealthy families throughout the South for over a decade. Elizabeth's method was always the same. She would identify attractive young women in vulnerable situations, research their backgrounds to construct plausible stories about family connections, then manipulate them into participating in elaborate theft schemes. She had successfully used this approach to steal thousands of dollars worth of property from unsuspecting families, always disappearing before her victims realized what had happened. When confronted with this evidence, Elizabeth initially attempted to maintain her deception, claiming that the authorities were mistaken and that she could provide additional proof of her identity. But when Whitmore threatened to summon the local sheriff, she abandoned her maternal persona entirely, revealing the cold, calculating personality that lay beneath her performance. The transformation was shocking to witness. The woman who had spent weeks playing the role of a loving, emotional mother became businesslike and threatening. She explained to Whitmore that Hannah had already been thoroughly prepared for their departure, that the young woman's loyalty now belonged to her rather than to the plantation, and that any attempt to prevent their leaving would result in consequences that he would regret. Elizabeth's confidence suggested that she believed her psychological manipulation of Hannah had been completely successful. She seemed certain that Hannah would choose to leave with her, regardless of what Whitmore or anyone else might say about her true identity. This confidence would prove to be both accurate and tragic. When Hannah was informed of the truth about Elizabeth's identity, her reaction was not relief or anger, but confusion and denial. She refused to believe that the woman she had accepted as her mother was actually a stranger and a criminal. The psychological bonds that Elizabeth had created were too strong to be broken by mere facts or evidence. Hannah insisted that the documents exposing Elizabeth were forgeries, that the authorities in Charleston were lying, and that the Whitmores were conspiring to prevent her from leaving the plantation. Her voice took on the same mechanical quality that others had noticed during her conversations with Elizabeth, as if she were reciting lessons that had been drilled into her memory. The most heartbreaking aspect of Hannah's response was her complete inability to recognize the manipulation to which she had been subjected. She genuinely believed that Elizabeth loved her, that their relationship was based on the sacred bond between mother and child, and that anyone who questioned this connection was motivated by jealousy or malice. When Mrs. Whitmore tried to explain the techniques that Elizabeth had used to control her thinking, Hannah became increasingly agitated and defensive. She accused Mrs. Whitmore of lying, of being cruel and heartless, and of trying to destroy the only family relationship she had ever known. The young woman, who had once been thoughtful and intelligent, seemed incapable of rational analysis when it came to her relationship with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, meanwhile, watched these confrontations with satisfaction, occasionally offering comments that reinforced Hannah's defensive responses. She had anticipated that her deception would eventually be exposed, and she had prepared Hannah for exactly this scenario. Every argument that the Whitmores made against her had been predicted and countered in advance through her psychological programming. The situation might have remained at this impasse indefinitely, but Elizabeth made a crucial mistake that would ultimately expose the full extent of her manipulation. During one of the heated discussions about her true identity, she became careless and revealed knowledge about Hannah's past that she could not have possessed if she were genuinely her mother. Sarah, the elderly house servant, was present during this conversation and immediately recognized the significance of Elizabeth's slip. The supposed mother had mentioned a specific incident from Hannah's childhood that had never been recorded in any document and had never been discussed in Elizabeth's presence. The only way Elizabeth could have known about the incident was if she had researched Hannah's background with extraordinary thoroughness. This revelation began to crack the psychological hold that Elizabeth had established over Hannah's mind. For the first time since Margaret's arrival, Hannah began to question aspects of her supposed mother's story. The questions were tentative and confused, but they represented the first sign that Elizabeth's manipulation might not be completely successful. Elizabeth recognized the danger immediately and attempted to reassert her control through increasingly desperate measures. She became more demanding and authoritarian, insisting that Hannah prove her loyalty by rejecting the Whitmores completely and committing to leaving the plantation immediately. These demands revealed the true nature of their relationship in a way that even Hannah could not ignore. The psychological breakdown that followed was devastating to witness. Hannah began to understand that the maternal love she had believed was genuine was actually a carefully constructed performance designed to exploit her emotional vulnerabilities. The realization shattered her sense of identity and left her feeling that she could trust no one, including herself. But Elizabeth was not finished. Recognizing that her original plan was failing, she attempted to salvage the situation through threats and intimidation. She revealed that she had accumulated detailed information about the plantation's operations, the Whitmore family's business relationships, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if they did not cooperate with her demands. Elizabeth also made it clear that Hannah was not her first victim, that she had successfully manipulated other young women into participating in similar schemes, and that she had no compunctions about destroying Hannah's life if she failed to prove useful. The maternal persona was completely abandoned, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator who saw other human beings as tools to be used and discarded. The threats extended beyond Hannah to the entire plantation community. Elizabeth had observed the relationships between the enslaved families, identified the strongest emotional bonds, and prepared to exploit these connections if necessary. She understood that the community's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability, the deep caring that people felt for each other's welfare. Thomas Whitmore realized that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple confidence artist. Elizabeth's psychological sophistication and her willingness to cause extensive emotional damage to achieve her goals suggested a level of manipulation that bordered on the pathological. He began to make arrangements to have her arrested and removed from the plantation, but Elizabeth anticipated his actions and accelerated her own plans. The crisis came to a head on a cold March morning when Elizabeth attempted to leave the plantation with Hannah, claiming that they were simply going for their usual walk. But instead of following their normal route around the grounds, Elizabeth directed Hannah toward a carriage that she had hidden in a grove of trees beyond the main buildings. Hannah's behavior during this attempted departure revealed the full extent of the psychological damage that she had suffered. She moved mechanically, following Elizabeth's directions without question or apparent awareness of what was happening. When Sarah tried to stop them, Hannah looked at her with eyes that seemed completely empty, as if her personality had been erased and replaced with something artificial. The alarm was raised when Sarah's shouts brought other members of the household running. Thomas Whitmore and several of the male servants pursued the carriage, catching up to it before it could reach the main road. What followed was a confrontation that would be remembered and whispered about on the plantation for decades to come. Elizabeth's reaction to being caught was neither panic nor resignation, but rage at having her plans disrupted. She screamed accusations at the Whitmores, claiming that they were kidnappers who had stolen Hannah from her rightful family, that they were criminals who profited from the separation of mothers and children, and that they would face divine punishment for their interference with the natural order. But perhaps most disturbing was Hannah's reaction to the confrontation. Instead of relief at being rescued, she seemed terrified of being separated from Elizabeth. She begged to be allowed to leave with her supposed mother, promising that she would be good and would never cause any trouble if they would just let her go. Her pleas were heartbreaking in their desperation and confusion. The psychological bonds that Elizabeth had created were so strong that Hannah could not conceive of existence without her supposed mother's guidance and approval. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of Elizabeth's deception and manipulation, Hannah clung to the relationship as if it were her only source of identity and meaning. Elizabeth was ultimately arrested and transported to Richmond to face charges of fraud and attempted theft. The legal proceedings revealed that she had victimized numerous families throughout Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, always using variations of the same maternal deception to manipulate vulnerable young women. Her real name was Elizabeth Morrison, and she had been operating under false identities for more than 15 years. The investigation into Elizabeth's background revealed a history of childhood abandonment and abuse that might have explained, though not excused, her manipulation of other people's emotional vulnerabilities. She had been orphaned at a young age, passed between reluctant relatives who viewed her as a burden, and had learned to survive through deception and exploitation of others' sympathy. But understanding Elizabeth's motivations provided little comfort to those who had witnessed the damage she inflicted on Hannah. The young woman's recovery from the psychological manipulation proved to be a long and difficult process that was complicated by her inability to trust her own perceptions and judgments. Hannah's behavior in the weeks following Elizabeth's arrest was erratic and deeply troubling. She alternated between periods of apparent normalcy and episodes where she would speak to Elizabeth as if she were still present, carrying on conversations with someone who existed only in her memory. She seemed unable to accept that the maternal relationship had been false, continuing to defend Elizabeth against all criticism and expressing hope that her mother would return to rescue her. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to help Hannah process what had happened to her, but the young woman's psychological state made meaningful communication almost impossible. She had been conditioned to distrust anyone who questioned her relationship with Elizabeth, and this conditioning proved remarkably resistant to logical argument or emotional appeal. The plantation's enslaved community rallied around Hannah with extraordinary compassion and patience. Sarah, in particular, spent hours sitting with her, not trying to argue or persuade, but simply providing a stable, caring presence that made no demands and offered no judgments. This approach proved more effective than direct confrontation, slowly helping Hannah to distinguish between genuine care and manipulation. The recovery process was marked by painful moments of clarity, when Hannah would suddenly understand aspects of what had been done to her. These realizations were often followed by periods of depression and self-blame, as she struggled to understand how she had been so completely deceived. The emotional pain of recognizing the manipulation was, in some ways, worse than the manipulation itself. Gradually, with the support of the plantation community and the passage of time, Hannah began to reclaim her own identity and judgment. The process was neither linear nor complete, and she would struggle with trust and self-confidence for the rest of her life. But she slowly learned to distinguish between genuine relationships and manipulative performances. The legal proceedings against Elizabeth concluded with her conviction on multiple counts of fraud and theft. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, though she served only 6 before dying of pneumonia in the Richmond Penitentiary. Her death was noted in the prison records without ceremony or mourning, the end of a life that had been devoted to exploiting the vulnerabilities of others. News of Elizabeth's death reached the Whitmore plantation in the spring of 1838. Hannah's reaction was complex and painful to witness. Despite everything she had learned about Elizabeth's manipulation, she grieved the loss of the woman who had claimed to be her mother. The grief was genuine, even though it was based on a relationship that had never truly existed. Hannah lived for many more years on the Whitmore plantation, never marrying but finding satisfaction in her work and in the relationships she built with the enslaved community. She became known for her ability to identify and help people who were being manipulated or exploited, using her painful experience to protect others from similar harm. The story of Hannah and Elizabeth was documented in several sources that survived into the 20th century. Thomas Whitmore's plantation records included detailed accounts of the incident, including copies of Elizabeth's fraudulent documents and correspondence with Charleston authorities. A journal kept by Mrs. Whitmore provided additional insights into Hannah's psychological state during and after the manipulation. The case was also mentioned in legal records from Elizabeth's trial, which included testimony from several of her previous victims. These records revealed that Hannah's experience was not unique, that Elizabeth had successfully manipulated dozens of young women using similar techniques over the course of her criminal career. Perhaps most importantly, the story was preserved in the oral tradition of the enslaved community. It passed down through generations as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of genuine care and support in healing psychological wounds. These oral accounts provided details about Hannah's recovery that were absent from the written records, offering insights into the resilience of the human spirit. In 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War, a historian researching plantation records discovered Whitmore's documents relating to the Hannah Green case. The historian, Dr. James Mitchell, was struck by the psychological sophistication of Elizabeth's manipulation techniques and by the detailed documentation of Hannah's recovery process. Dr. Mitchell's notes, discovered in 1866 in a trunk of papers left in a Richmond boarding house, included observations about the case that were remarkably advanced for their time. He recognized that Elizabeth had used what would later be understood as systematic psychological conditioning to control Hannah's thoughts and behavior, and he documented the methods that had proved effective in helping Hannah recover her independence. The boarding house where Dr. Mitchell's papers were found was scheduled for demolition, and the trunk of documents was nearly discarded before a worker recognized their potential historical value. The papers were donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where they remained largely unexamined until a graduate student studying antebellum psychology discovered them in 1958. By the time the Hannah Green case received serious academic attention, most of the physical evidence had been lost or destroyed. The Whitmore plantation had been abandoned during Reconstruction, and the main house had burned down in 1879. The slave quarters and outbuildings had gradually deteriorated until nothing remained but foundation stones overgrown with Virginia creeper and wild roses. But the psychological insights preserved in Dr. Mitchell's notes proved remarkably relevant to 20th century understanding of manipulation and conditioning. His observations about Elizabeth's techniques anticipated many of the findings of modern research into psychological abuse and the methods used by confidence artists to exploit their victims. The case also provided valuable information about the resilience factors that had enabled Hannah to eventually recover from her traumatic experience. The consistent support of the enslaved community, the refusal of people like Sarah to abandon her during her most difficult periods, and the gradual rebuilding of trust through small, non-threatening interactions all became recognized as crucial elements in recovery from psychological manipulation. In 1964, the last surviving foundation stones of the Whitmore plantation were removed during the construction of a modern highway. The land where Hannah had lived and worked, where she had been victimized and had eventually healed, disappeared beneath asphalt and concrete, but the lessons of her experience continued to resonate through the documented accounts that had preserved her story. The final chapter of Hannah's documented story comes from a letter written in 1856 by a visitor to the Whitmore plantation. The visitor, a journalist traveling through Virginia, noted the presence of an elderly enslaved woman who had become something of a local legend for her ability to help people who had been deceived or manipulated by confidence artists and traveling swindlers. The letter described Hannah as a woman of remarkable dignity and insight, someone who could recognize the signs of psychological manipulation from the briefest conversation, and who had developed techniques for helping victims recover their independence and self-confidence. Her reputation had spread beyond the plantation, and people would sometimes travel considerable distances to seek her guidance. According to the journalist's account, Hannah never spoke directly about her own experience with Elizabeth Morrison, but her understanding of manipulation tactics was so sophisticated that it could only have come from personal experience. She had transformed her own victimization into a form of wisdom that could benefit others, turning her greatest vulnerability into her greatest strength. The letter also noted that Hannah remained unmarried and had never had children, suggesting that her experience with Elizabeth had left lasting effects on her ability to form intimate relationships. But she had created an extensive network of relationships within the enslaved community and had become a person to whom others turned for guidance and support during their own times of crisis. Hannah Green died in 1861. Just before the beginning of the Civil War that would transform the society in which she had lived her entire life. She was buried in the slave cemetery behind the Whitmore plantation, her grave marked only by a simple wooden cross that bore her name and the dates of her birth and death. The cemetery itself was abandoned after the war, and the wooden markers gradually deteriorated until no trace remained of individual graves. By the early 20th century, the entire area had been reclaimed by forest, and the location of Hannah's final resting place was lost to memory and time. But the psychological insights that emerged from her experience with Elizabeth Morrison continued to influence understanding of manipulation and recovery well into the modern era. Her story became a case study in resilience, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation could be overcome with time, support, and the gradual rebuilding of trust and self-confidence. The Hannah Green case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of psychological manipulation from the antebellum period. The combination of official records, personal accounts, legal documents, and oral tradition created a comprehensive picture of both the techniques used by manipulators and the methods that proved effective in helping victims recover their autonomy. Perhaps most importantly, Hannah's story demonstrated that genuine care and patience could overcome even the most systematic psychological conditioning. The enslaved community's refusal to abandon her during her most difficult period, their willingness to provide support without demanding immediate gratitude or recovery, and their understanding that healing required time and consistency rather than dramatic interventions, all contributed to her eventual recovery. The lessons of Hannah's experience proved relevant far beyond the specific context of antebellum slavery. The psychological techniques used by Elizabeth Morrison were fundamentally similar to those employed by manipulators in many different settings and time periods. The factors that contributed to Hannah's recovery were equally universal, providing insights that would prove valuable to anyone working with victims of psychological manipulation. In the end, Hannah Green's story was both deeply specific to her time and place and remarkably universal in its insights into human psychology and resilience. Her experience with Elizabeth Morrison revealed the devastating effects of sophisticated manipulation, but her recovery demonstrated the healing power of genuine community support and the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to reclaim autonomy and dignity, even after the most profound psychological violation. The rural Virginia countryside where these events took place has been transformed beyond recognition by the passage of time. Modern highways cross the land where tobacco fields once stretched to the horizon, and suburban developments occupy the sites of former plantations. But the psychological truths revealed by Hannah's experience remain as relevant today as they were in 1831. The story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who exploit our deepest emotional needs and vulnerabilities. Elizabeth Morrison's manipulation was effective precisely because it appeared to offer Hannah the family connection that she had always longed for. The lesson is not that we should avoid forming emotional attachments, but that we should remain vigilant about the difference between genuine care and manipulative performance. Hannah's recovery also demonstrates that healing from psychological manipulation is possible, even when the conditioning has been systematic and sophisticated. The key factors in her recovery, consistent support, patient understanding, and the gradual rebuilding of trust, remain the foundation of effective treatment for victims of psychological abuse today. The archives that preserve Hannah's story are scattered across multiple institutions, and many of the original documents have deteriorated beyond legibility. But enough material survives to provide a comprehensive understanding of what may have been one of the most sophisticated cases of psychological manipulation in antebellum America. The Virginia Historical Society holds the largest collection of materials related to the case, including Thomas Whitmore's plantation records, correspondence with Charleston authorities, and legal documents from Elizabeth Morrison's trial. These official records provide the factual framework of the story, documenting dates, legal proceedings, and the basic sequence of events that unfolded during those crucial months in 1831. Mrs. Whitmore's personal journal, donated to the Society in 1923 by her great-granddaughter, offers intimate insights into the psychological dynamics that the official records could not capture. Her observations about Hannah's behavior during Elizabeth's visit, her growing suspicions about the supposed mother's true motives, and her accounts of Hannah's difficult recovery process provide crucial details about the human cost of the manipulation. Dr. James Mitchell's research notes, discovered decades after his death, represent perhaps the most valuable source for understanding the psychological aspects of the case. His analysis of Elizabeth's techniques and his documentation of Hannah's recovery process were remarkably advanced for their time, anticipating many of the insights that would not become widely accepted until the 20th century. The oral tradition, preserved within the African American community of Central Virginia, maintained additional details about Hannah's story that were absent from the written records. These accounts, collected by historians in the 1930s and 40s, provided information about Hannah's daily life, her relationships within the enslaved community, and the specific methods that proved effective in helping her heal from her traumatic experience. One particularly valuable oral account came from the descendants of Sarah, the elderly house servant who had been instrumental in Hannah's recovery. According to family tradition, Sarah had developed specific techniques for identifying and countering psychological manipulation, methods that she had learned through her experience with Hannah and that she had passed down to her children and grandchildren. These techniques included careful observation of changes in a person's speech patterns, recognition of the mechanical quality that often characterized the responses of manipulation victims, and understanding of the importance of providing consistent support without making demands for gratitude or immediate recovery. Sarah's approach emphasized patience, consistency, and the gradual rebuilding of trust, rather than dramatic confrontations or attempts to argue victims out of their conditioned responses. The effectiveness of Sarah's methods was documented not only in Hannah's recovery, but in several other cases where members of the enslaved community had successfully helped people who had been victimized by traveling confidence artists. The plantation system, despite its inherent cruelties, had created tight-knit communities where people looked out for each other's welfare and had developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and resilience. Elizabeth Morrison's criminal career was extensively documented in legal records from multiple jurisdictions throughout the South. Court files from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia revealed that she had been operating her maternal deception scheme for at least 15 years before her encounter with Hannah. Her victims included young women from various backgrounds, though she seemed to prefer targets who were isolated, vulnerable, and possessed skills or attributes that could be exploited for financial gain. The pattern was always similar. Elizabeth would research her targets extensively, construct plausible stories about family connections, then use a combination of claimed maternal authority and sophisticated psychological techniques to gain control over their thoughts and behavior. She would typically maintain the manipulation for several weeks or months, gathering information and preparing for a major theft before disappearing with her victims and whatever valuables she had been able to obtain. What made Elizabeth's approach particularly effective was her ability to identify and exploit the specific emotional vulnerabilities of each victim. In Hannah's case, she recognized the young woman's deep longing for family connection and her uncertainty about her own identity and place in the world. She constructed her maternal persona specifically to address these needs, making the manipulation feel like the answer to Hannah's deepest wishes rather than an external imposition. The psychological techniques that Elizabeth employed were sophisticated enough to suggest formal training or extensive experience with human behavior. Her understanding of conditioning, her use of repetition and reinforcement, and her ability to gradually reshape her victims' perceptions and loyalties demonstrated knowledge that was unusual for someone without medical or academic background. Some historians have speculated that Elizabeth may have worked with or learned from practitioners of mesmerism or other psychological techniques that were becoming popular in certain circles during the early 19th century. The systematic nature of her approach and her understanding of how to create psychological dependence suggested exposure to theories about the malleability of human consciousness that were being developed by various researchers and practitioners. But regardless of where Elizabeth learned her techniques, the effectiveness of her manipulation was undeniable. Court records showed that most of her previous victims had never fully recovered from their experiences, remaining confused and traumatized long after the deception was exposed. Hannah's eventual recovery was unusual and appeared to be largely due to the exceptional support she received from the Whitmore plantation community. The legal proceedings against Elizabeth revealed additional disturbing details about her methods and motivations. Testimony from previous victims showed that she had no genuine emotional attachment to the young women she manipulated, viewing them purely as tools to be used for her own advantage. Her maternal performances were calculated acts designed to achieve specific goals, not expressions of any real feelings or desires for family connection. Perhaps most chilling was evidence that Elizabeth had planned to abandon Hannah once she had served her purpose, just as she had abandoned previous victims. The maternal love that had seemed so convincing was designed to be temporary, lasting only long enough to accomplish Elizabeth's criminal objectives. The young women who fell under her influence were ultimately disposable to her, their emotional devastation merely an acceptable cost of doing business. Elizabeth's childhood history, revealed during the sentencing phase of her trial, provided some context for understanding her behavior, but did not excuse the deliberate cruelty of her actions. She had indeed been orphaned and had experienced abandonment and abuse, but many people with similar backgrounds did not become predators who specialized in exploiting others' emotional vulnerabilities. The judge who sentenced Elizabeth noted that her crimes were particularly heinous because they involved the systematic destruction of trust and family bonds, fundamental relationships that held society together. Her manipulation of maternal love was seen as an assault on one of the most sacred connections between human beings, making her crimes worse than simple theft or fraud. Elizabeth's death in prison was documented in the Richmond penitentiary records, which noted that she had remained unrepentant throughout her incarceration. She continued to maintain that her victims had been willing participants in her schemes, that she had provided them with opportunities and experiences they would never have had otherwise, and that their subsequent trauma was due to their own weakness rather than her manipulation. This lack of remorse was consistent with the pattern that had emerged during her trial, where she had shown no empathy for the young women whose lives she had damaged. Her inability to recognize the harm she had caused suggested a profound absence of normal human emotional responses, a coldness that made her manipulation techniques all the more effective and terrifying. Hannah's story after Elizabeth's arrest and conviction demonstrated both the lasting effects of sophisticated psychological manipulation and the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to heal when provided with appropriate support and time. Her recovery was neither quick nor complete, but it was genuine and allowed her to reclaim her autonomy and dignity. The process of healing required Hannah to completely reconstruct her sense of identity and her understanding of relationships. She had to learn to distinguish between genuine care and manipulative performance, to trust her own perceptions and judgments, and to believe that she was worthy of authentic love and respect. These lessons took years to internalize and were complicated by periodic setbacks and moments of doubt. But the enslaved community's unwavering support provided the foundation for Hannah's recovery. Unlike Elizabeth's manipulative love, which had been conditional and designed to serve specific purposes, the care that Hannah received from people like Sarah was genuine, patient, and made no demands for gratitude or immediate improvement. This contrast helped Hannah understand the difference between authentic and artificial relationships. Hannah's eventual ability to help other victims of manipulation represented the transformation of her greatest vulnerability into her greatest strength. Her understanding of psychological manipulation was so thorough and intuitive that she could recognize the signs of conditioning in others and provide guidance for recovery based on her own experience. The techniques that Hannah developed for helping manipulation victims were remarkably similar to methods that would later be formalized by 20th century psychology. She understood the importance of creating safe environments where victims could process their experiences without judgment, the need for patient support that made no demands for quick recovery, and the value of helping people rebuild trust gradually through small, consistent interactions. Hannah's work with other victims also provided her with a sense of purpose and meaning that helped complete her own healing process. By transforming her traumatic experience into a source of wisdom that could benefit others, she was able to find value in her suffering and to create something positive from the devastation that Elizabeth had caused. The broader implications of Hannah's story extended far beyond the specific circumstances of antebellum Virginia. The psychological dynamics that she experienced were fundamentally similar to those found in many different types of abusive relationships and manipulative situations. Her recovery demonstrated universal principles about resilience and healing that remained relevant across different time periods and cultural contexts. Modern researchers studying psychological manipulation and recovery have found remarkable parallels between Hannah's experience and the accounts of 20th and 21st century victims. The techniques used by contemporary manipulators often echo Elizabeth's methods, and the factors that contribute to recovery continue to mirror those that proved effective in Hannah's case. The documentation of Hannah's story also provided valuable insights into the sophistication of psychological understanding within enslaved communities. The methods that Sarah and others used to help Hannah recover demonstrated knowledge about human psychology and resilience that was typically unrecognized by the dominant society, but was highly developed within marginalized communities. This understanding was born of necessity, as people in vulnerable situations had to develop sophisticated skills for reading human behavior, recognizing threats, and supporting each other through traumatic experiences. The enslaved community's approach to helping Hannah represented generations of accumulated wisdom about survival and resilience under difficult circumstances. The loss of the physical sites where Hannah's story unfolded represents a broader pattern in American history, where the landscapes that witnessed the experiences of enslaved people have often been erased or transformed beyond recognition. The Whitmore plantation, like thousands of others, has disappeared beneath modern development, taking with it the tangible connections to the past. But the preservation of Hannah's story in documents and oral tradition ensures that the psychological and emotional truths of her experience continue to resonate. The archives that hold these materials serve as repositories for understanding that remains relevant to contemporary struggles with manipulation, abuse, and recovery. The Hannah Green case stands as a testament to both the devastating effects of systematic psychological manipulation and the remarkable capacity of human beings to heal from even the most profound violations of trust. It demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are often those who exploit our deepest needs and vulnerabilities. But it also shows that genuine community support and patient care can overcome even the most sophisticated conditioning. Perhaps most importantly, Hannah's story reminds us that healing from psychological trauma is possible, even when the manipulation has been systematic and the damage seems irreversible. The factors that contributed to her recovery, consistent support, patient understanding, the gradual rebuilding of trust, and the transformation of vulnerability into strength, remain the foundation of effective treatment for victims of psychological abuse today. The rural Virginia countryside where these events unfolded has been transformed by centuries of change, but the human truths revealed by Hannah's experience remain constant. Her story serves as both a warning about the dangers of sophisticated manipulation and a source of hope for those who have survived similar violations of trust and dignity. Until today, some say that on quiet winter mornings in central Virginia, when the mist rises from the James River and the air carries the scent of wood smoke and distant memories, the lessons of Hannah Green's experience continue to whisper through the landscape, not as supernatural echoes, but as reminders that the capacity for both great cruelty and great compassion exists within the human heart, and that the choice between them shapes not only individual lives, but the very fabric of society itself. The archives that preserve her story remain accessible to researchers and historians, ensuring that the insights gained from her experience with Elizabeth Morrison will continue to inform understanding of psychological manipulation and recovery for generations to come. In this way, Hannah's suffering was not in vain, but became a source of knowledge that continues to help others avoid similar victimization and find their way back to wholeness when trust has been shattered. The silence that now covers the land where Hannah lived and worked is not the oppressive silence of secrets and manipulation, but the peaceful quiet of resolution and understanding. Her story has been told, her suffering acknowledged, and her recovery celebrated as a triumph of the human spirit over even the most calculated cruelty.